Hello, I am Farah Guerrero, and this is The Blue Hour on CITR 101.9 FM at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are broadcasting from the traditional ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Long before radio, books, or concert halls, this land was a place of listening, storytelling, language, and ceremony, and it is a privilege to gather in a spirit of listening here today. My guest is Professor Alex Fisher from the UBC School of Music. Alex Fisher is both a distinguished musicologist and a performing musician. Trained as a trombonist, he later specialized in the Renaissance sackbut and has performed with leading early music ensembles. He is also a co-founder of Cappella Borealis and coordinates early music here at UBC. As a scholar, Professor Fisher studies the musical, religious, and cultural worlds of 16th and 17th century Germany, with interests in soundscapes, ritual, and the relationship between music and religious identity during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. His work has appeared in leading journals, and there are many publications, including the Journal of Musicology, Early Music History, and the 16th Century Journal. His books include Music and Religious Identity and Counter-Reformation Augsburg, and Music, Piety, and Propaganda, the Soundscapes of Counter-Reformation Bavaria. Today we'll be discussing some of his publications, his chapter Bells in a book which is titled Information, a Historical Companion, published by Princeton University Press in 2021, and his article Hearing the Trumpets of the Church Militant, Weather Bells and Supernatural Audition in Post-Reformation Germany, published in the 16th Century Journal in 2022. Together, they invite us to think about bells, not simply as musical instruments, but as technologies of communication, symbols of civic and religious life, and, for many centuries, voices believed to reach both human and supernatural listeners. So, Alex, welcome to the Blue Hour.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
I would like to talk first about you, the musician. And you first encountered this very old instrument called the sackbut while studying, I believe, maybe in your graduate studies. Was that right?
Or my undergraduate
studies. Okay. Mm-hmm. Was that Northwestern?
Northwestern
yes.
University, correct. Yes.
And so for listeners who may have never heard of such an instrument, could you tell us about this early form of what, might be a kind of what became the modern trombone, but, this goes back centuries.
Yeah, the sackbut is an instrument which resembles the modern trombone. There are some small differences, and actually, the trombone is perhaps the one instrument that has changed the least, I would say, in the last 600 years. A Renaissance sackbut also has a slide. It also has a bell. It also has a mouthpiece. It's played in a similar fashion. But the construction is a little bit different, and it's quite a different sound from a modern trombone. Modern trombones were designed to fill up gigantic 19th century and 20th century concert halls, whereas the Renaissance and Baroque version of the trombone were really designed as chamber music instruments. They were designed to blend with singers, blend with other instruments, and they were especially prized for church music, actually. And so the sound of the early instrument, it's much more intimate, much more delicate, but it actually is very versatile, and it allows us to play with all kinds of different instruments and voices as we try to recreate that sound world from 400 or 500 years ago.
And it brought me back to Venice. A few hundred years ago, there was some names, Andrea Gabrielli, Giovanni Gabrielli, that would have been using these even at like St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice. But also Monteverdi, which is this extraordinary composer of opera, who I spoke with your colleague a couple of weeks ago, Claudio Veluntini, who we talked about Monteverdi. So this he even used the sackbut in his I guess vespas, as they called them, these pieces of music. But what's interesting was that what you said, it seems that it is an instrument that fuses well with the human voice. Do you feel that?
I absolutely do feel that, and really to the point where if I'm playing a modern trombone, I think it's extremely difficult actually to blend with others. The instrument just wants to be loud. Whereas with the Renaissance instrument, it really does play at a volume level that is commensurate with the human voice and with the violin. So it really is no surprise that composers like you mentioned, Andrea Gabrielli, Giovanni Gabrielli, Claudio Monteverdi, the sackbut was a very natural choice, I think, to add to their ensembles. And I might just add quickly, your listeners might be interested in the fact that at the end of July, Early Music Vancouver will be producing the first major opera in the operatic repertory, Monteverdi's Orfeo of 1607. And myself and my colleagues were very thrilled to be a part of that production at the Chan Center.
That's amazing. Now, Claudio, your colleague, not the Claudio Monteverdi, did mention of that, and I'm going to get tickets to that because that looks incredible. And there's 2 shows.
That's correct, yeah.
So, but let's bring you to us to what you co-founded. So, Cappella Borealis, which is an ensemble. I don't remember how long you've been together as musicians, but tell us about that and the vision behind it, and what you've been doing all these years with bringing these instruments to life and breathing. I guess many things that we think is something of the past is something that's actually still part of our lives.
Well, I've been playing the Renaissance sackbut since I was an undergraduate, on and off. And I've always kept an eye out here at UBC and here in Vancouver for talented musicians that might be interested in picking up this instrument and learning it. And I discovered that there were a couple of people who have actually played the instrument before. So I think it was roughly 11 or 12 years ago that I started putting out some feelers to some very talented trombone players in the community, and to find out, if they've played sackbut before, if they're willing to learn it, if they're willing to play it. And we've played together as a quartet. It's myself, Ellen Marple, Jeremy Berkman, and Nathan Wilkes for about the last dozen years, and we've been really excited to collaborate with a number of different organizations for different productions of music from the 16th and the 17th centuries. And my principal job is as a historian and academic, but it's always thrilling to me to keep one of my feet in the performance world. And so I'm extremely grateful to my colleagues in Cappella Borealis that they've really been able to make that happen for me and for us as a collective. So I hope that we're able to add a kind of a distinctive ensemble sound to the local musical scene, and so far it's going really well.
And now I regret I didn't ask you to bring the sackbut into the studio, because it would be nice to hear you play. Now, I want to move on, but I'm still very intrigued by this instrument. The name there are many names, if I'm not mistaken. Sackbut is one of them, but the origins, we believe, have a French origin. But there is this push and pull sort of meaning embedded in the name, if I'm right. And can you describe the instrument, how it works, and even the mouthpiece is a little bit different than the modern trombone, and also the materials. And also the bell, which I really like because, of course, the bell is a big part, but it will be a great segue to when we actually start talking about bells in a different sense.
Yeah, sackbut literally just means a push-pull. And
That's simple.
That word does come out of the French, and there are English adaptations of that term, like sagbut and shagbutt, all kinds of very interesting, slightly strange terms. But in other languages, they've just kept the word for trombone for the last 500 years. So a Posaune in German denotes both a modern trombone as well as a Renaissance instrument. Le trombone in French or Italian, I can't remember which, it literally means, a paper clip. And in a lot of ways, a sackbut looks like a big paper clip, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, you make the sound by buzzing your lips through a metal mouthpiece. The sound goes into the instrument, and you change the length of the instrument and therefore the pitch by moving the slide in and out. And the instrument, like you said, it does culminate in something that we call a bell. But it is a bell that is not nearly as large as a modern trombone. And that's because the instrument was not designed to project its sound as violently as the modern trombone. So it's an instrument that's very well suited to its historical context.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you said, your research definitely goes beyond the music side, but there is this word soundscapes, which we just before we went on air, we were talking about, which I would love you to ground us in. But it is music history that comes into this sort of sound history, and then soundscapes, which has been coined, interestingly, as you were saying, that may have some relevance to here right in Vancouver.
Yeah, I mean, the term soundscape was really popularized by a composer with deep roots in the Lower Mainland, F. Murray Schafer, who was a composer and a theorist. And Murray Schafer really began to popularize the term soundscape. He started to use it to describe his own compositions, starting in the late 1960s. And some of these compositions were works that combined artificial sounds with the sounds of the natural environment. In a way, some of these compositions were like more like happenings rather than pieces of music that you would actually write down in a score that could be accurately reproduced ad infinitum. But he really developed this term soundscape to describe the total sound environment that we are surrounded in and that we perceive on a day-to-day basis. And this soundscape can include musical sounds, but it can include an infinite variety of natural sounds, of animal sounds, of artificial sounds that are not necessarily considered to be musical sounds. And he really wanted us to tune our ears to this environment and think critically about the kinds of sounds that we want in our environment and other kinds of sounds that he felt were less welcome. And so he was quite prejudiced in many ways against many industrial sounds that he felt were sort of polluting our soundscape and detuning our ears to the richer variety of natural sounds that are around us. So his project in many ways was a critical project, a cultural project. For me, as a historian, I'm really trying to think not about the industrial sound world, but lost sound worlds that may have existed 400 and 500 years ago. And I got into this because I've always been particularly interested in religious history, in the ways that different religious communities related to each other. And sometimes the most dramatic and effective way that a community can define itself is through the medium of sound. It's through the medium of singing, the medium of speech, the medium of bells, and sometimes other kinds of sounds like the firing of cannon or muskets, or the beating of drums or the playing of pipes. And so I would really say that's really been the core of my academic work in recent years, is trying to think about the ways that sound was a medium of sometimes social distinction and religious distinction, but also something that bridges communities potentially. Because you can close your eyes, but you can't close your ears. And therefore, different religious communities in early modern Europe were hearing the sounds of others and engaging with those sounds, sometimes in a positive way and sometimes in a negative way.
And this is very interesting. I like what you said about the sort of search of lost sounds. I had mentioned to you earlier before we came on air that I had grown up on this campus, and I remember the song of the foghorn, and it is a childhood memory that I will always associate with my childhood. It was a very distinctive sound that when on a very foggy day we would hear. And now, fast forward, I have a second life in a place in Italy that is still very medieval and Roman. It's a town in northern Italy in the Alps called Aosta. And I wake up every day to the sound of church bells, and they ring all day as well. They are signatures of time. So if I didn't have a watch, I could certainly know what time of the day it was. And then if I bike high enough in the Alps and I get into now alpine country, I'm going to hear other sounds, and those are going to be cowbells that are going to be reverberating through the mountain landscape. So tell us about this idea of, that is a very old thing that still continues. So a lost sound that in my context, even as a Canadian, I never grew up with sounds like this, and yet every time I go to the second home, I hear it. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question because it gets into the issue of industrialization to some degree. We have lots of different ways of telling the time of day these days that do not require church bells. We all have wristwatches and iPhones. We can get time signals from the radio, from all kinds of different mechanical clocks. And so the need, I think, of people in the modern day for bells is a different one. And I feel strongly that there is a big element of nostalgia involved in if you travel to Europe, you are perceiving a soundscape that is partly lost in certain ways, and we don't have the ears or the brains anymore to quite capture all of the different distinctions of different kinds of bell sounds. when I go to Europe to do my research, I'm surrounded in just a wash, an atmosphere of bell sounds every single day, but I simply am not trained or tuned to all of the different possible meanings. If we go back before the industrial age, I think there's a very good case to be made that the sounds of bells structured both time and space for pre-modern populations. They didn't just tell the clock time, but they also gave you information about what Murray Schafer actually called qualitative time instead of quantitative time. So qualitative time refers to the cycle of the church, the liturgical calendar, the different seasons of the religious year. It tells you when the sun is coming up. It tells you when the sun is going down. It's carefully tied to the observations of astronomy. Bells tell you when the market is opening. They tell you when the market is closing. Bells were rung to warn people about imminent disasters and tribulations, the approach of enemies. Fire that's broken out in the city would be signaled by frantic bell sounds coming from the towers. And bells, in fact, were also rung to dispel the clouds that create thunderstorms. And so before the age of the lightning rod, before we knew the mechanisms by which thunder was produced, thunderstorms were often considered to be a sign of divine wrath, of God's disapproval for a sinful population. And so by ringing the church bells, bells compelled people to pray, to ask for God's mercy, to avert these oncoming disasters. And depending on what religion, what faith you belonged to, bells might compel prayer. But for Catholic populations in particular, they actually thought that the sound of the bell could actually drive the clouds away and could actually drive away the demons and witches that were in the clouds that were thought to cause these thunderstorms. So you can see that bells in the pre-modern era, they have such a rich variety of functions that are kind of lost to us today because our entire environment has changed.
I was really surprised to find a publication of yours in this book, Information, a Historical Companion, because it really is about how human beings have, made, transmitted, organized, trusted, and received information across time. And so you have a chapter called Bells, and it's really seen, of course, as this medium that was, not just sending public information through sound, but also through, as you say, this pre-modern communication technology that what I was also quite intrigued by was that it wasn't just religious, it was also very much in the non-religious sort of world. So whether it was having bells to have people come in, I was using my writer's imagination, maybe to the square to pay their taxes, or to, bells were rung for death, for, so that people knew about a death in the community, perhaps. And so the civic side of bells as this form of communication was really, really interesting. So the secular and religious seemed to, and as you say, if you were trained to know and we could go back in time and learn how to hear them, we would know whether it was they were calling people to the church to pray or they were calling people to some sort of civic duty.
Yeah, I think it was Schaeffer, again, who used this terminology with reference to bells, that bells have both a centripetal function as well as a centrifugal function. And so bells were rung to call people together. They called people to church services. They compelled people to pray. In the case of more earthly troubles like fires or floods or thunderstorms or the approach of enemies, they could call, for example, the local militia together to defend the city. But they also have this centrifugal kind of function of driving away evil, of driving away clouds, of driving away evil spirits, of driving away witches. So that's something that's always been fascinating to me, is this dual function of bells. And in both cases, bells are also very much tied up with notions of power and notions of authority. In many places in pre-modern Europe, the most powerful institution was, in fact, the church. The church had a monopoly over the highest towers in the city in which bells were hung. Bells were extremely expensive to produce and to procure. In some cities that had strong civic governments, there would be bells that would be owned by the city itself and would be used for various kinds of secular functions. Conversely, people that were unauthorized to ring the bells, if somehow they managed to break into the church tower and ring the bells of their own volition, that was considered a signal of rebellion, of revolt, because you have common people appropriating to themselves one of the most potent symbols of sonic authority in the city, which is the bell.
And then you touch on something which was really interesting. It resembles baptism. So this consecration ritual. So a priest could be washing the bell with salt and oil and chanting, prayers and anointing it with, like that. That makes the bell now an object of some sacredness, it seems.
Yeah, it's one of the most fascinating and, in fact, controversial elements of the history of bells. It has been established that the ringing of metal was considered to have magical or supernatural power going back to the ancient world. And when bells were widely introduced into Western Christianity from the 6th century, the 7th century onward, I think they retained some elements of that philosophy. So you're right, there was a consecration ritual that was developed for an ordained priest to actually bless a newly cast bell. And by conducting this liturgy, by washing the bell in holy water, by anointing it in oil, by reciting the proper liturgical texts, it actually granted the bell a kind of a sacral power that the bronze alone did not have. And not only that, when they cast bells in the Middle Ages and in Catholic Europe of the Renaissance, they would often add inscriptions to the bell that actually speak directly to its power, not just to call people together for prayer, but also to drive away all manner of tribulations. And so I say it was controversial because there was actually a lot of debate in pre-modern Europe about where does the power of the bell actually reside? Does it reside in the sound that it makes? In other words, are the demons and witches flying through the air, are they actually hearing the sounds of this bell and desisting from their evil plots against human beings? So is it the sound, or is it that act of consecration that gives the bell a kind of a sacral quality to it? Does God hear the bell when it's rung? And does it make a difference if the bell has been consecrated or not consecrated? And it gets into a very complicated history that we can talk about or not after the Protestant Reformation, where the Protestants really discounted the power of consecrated objects, things like bells, things like amulets, things like crosses and candles. And Protestants like Martin Luther and his successors would say, no, 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 it has nothing to do with the actual sound of the bell, much less its consecration by the clergy. But if the sound of the bell compels people to pray, then that is the one and only possible use of this instrument. And so we have this debate that unfolds through the 16th century, the 17th century, and the 18th century.
And this certainly is really spelled out in the hearing the trumpets of the church militant, weather bells and supernatural edition in post-Reformation Germany, this recent article of yours. But what's interesting, too, is that even despite the objections to the bells on the different, the sides, and you mentioned Luther, but they still, the bells continue to ring. And that's interesting, that the bells don't really stop. Am I right on that?
That's absolutely true. In fact, the Lutherans do continue to ring their bells, but they're constantly, the pastors, the theologians, they're constantly trying to remind their parishioners that it is not about the sound, it is about the prayer. But even Protestants, they had a notion of supernatural beings like demons and witches. That wasn't only a Catholic belief. Even Luther believed that there were demons in the air that were out there, to tempt us away from the right path. So, Luther acknowledged that, and his successors, they acknowledged that bell ringing was still useful. It was still something that we can do, but it has to be understood in the right manner and the right context. If it's something that makes people pray, then that is what they're really after. They're trying to get beyond what they would have regarded as a superstitious notion of the sound of a bell, and trying to get closer to what does the bell make people do. And that is what God is hearing. He is not hearing the sound of the bell, but he is hearing the prayers that are compelled by that sound. Now, were the Lutherans successful in convincing a broader population that bells have no magical effects? No, they were not successful in that. And we know this because they're constantly having to repeat this warning, this admonition in their sermons that, you have to ignore the sound and focus on the prayer. But this is an absolutely tenacious kind of listening practice that goes back many, many centuries. And it would take much more than a handful of Lutheran theologians to eliminate that belief.
And then it's important when you say it goes back many centuries. So the first sort of traces of bells as we know it, I guess historians can go back to Southeast Asia, maybe 3000 BCE, which maybe they would have spread to places like India and China and the Near East, and then eventually the Mediterranean. And there are examples as well as in Africa and pre-Columbian Americas. But this Western sort of bells, and I asked you if you had a bell, and you had one, but you don't know really too much about the bell, but it was a gift from a student. Maybe you can ring it. And
Okay, I'll preface this by saying this is just a small handbell, and I know really nothing about its origins, but it very well might resemble an early bell that might have been used in the Middle Ages to call people to prayer or services.
Now, you have said that bells can be as small as, well, under a centimeter. And then you mention one that is in the Kremlin in Moscow that is 6.6 meters in diameter, weighing some 200,000 kilograms. So bells have all sizes. They have, as you've said, many purposes, many meanings across time and space, cultures. And I was also trying to think about what the modern bell is. So I asked my son, who's almost at the end of high school, what the bell sounds like, because that's a school bell that I remember growing up with. But my husband, who's from Argentina, maybe didn't have the modern bell that I grew up with, but he actually has memories of a real bell, of the administration coming out and ringing a real bell when recess or lunch or whatever was over. So what do you think when you're in this sort of research mind, and it goes back to, going back to where I go to Italy often, when you think of the modern bell, is there such a thing? Do you think our soundscapes have anything that is similar? It's clearly it's part of our human memory, and we react to bells. Why do you think your chapter belonged in that book? Because that book had such a cross section of many ideas of how information and communication has been dispersed over time, and so how do you feel about?
Well, I think the justification for a chapter on bells rests principally on the idea that in an age before widespread literacy, and particularly in cities where sight lines were often restricted, streets were very narrow. You could really only capture information with your eyes, to the end of the next street or so. It was very difficult to visually apprehend the city from a subject position. So what that means is that sonic information, and maybe bells are the most profound, widespread, and most detailed mode of sonic information that was available to pre-modern populations. And so that's why I say I think bells had a lot to do with structuring people's sense not only of time, because they certainly relied on bells to understand what the time of day was and what the liturgical season was. But they also needed bells for a much wider variety of functions. You had night watchmen going through the city, ringing bells at intervals, which was actually not a disturbing sound, but a reassuring sound to many in many cities, especially before the advent of electric lighting. But bells also taught people how to understand the space that they lived in. A bell that hung in a parish church, for example, the boundary of the parish was not necessarily a fixed visual geographical boundary, but was often understood as the radius at which you could hear its sound from the tower. And that distance could actually change depending on wind and weather and humidity. And so bells were actually structuring sonic space. You might even say they produced the space of the pre-modern parish church, because I think it was understood as much sonically as it was visually. So I would argue that, it's that profound element of sonic information that really justifies the presence of that chapter. And, thinking of bells today, things have certainly changed, and it really depends on your own position and positionality. In many European cities, there are churches that still do have distinctive and differentiated cycles of bell ringing. There's a particular bell to mark the beginning of a church service. In Catholic churches, there's a particular bell that is rung when the priest blesses the Eucharist, the bread and the wine, mystically transforming them into the flesh and blood of Jesus Christ. That moment is often marked by a bell sound. And you can have all kinds of different combinations of bells to mark different kinds of liturgical occasions, festal occasions. And so some of that pre-modern practice still persists. If we walk up into the Italian Alps, we can still hear some of the same sounds of herds of animals with bells that we would have heard hundreds of years ago. It's just that with, after industrialization, our lifestyles have changed to the extent that we have partly lost that understanding, I think, of the different functions of different bells. Whereas 400, 500 years ago, people could recognize the specific timbre of a bell, the specific location of it, and what kind of information it was trying to convey. And so this is what Murray Schafer would have called, he called it a hi-fi soundscape as opposed to a lo-fi soundscape. Mm-hmm. In a hi-fi soundscape, we have this rich, highly differentiated sound environment around us that we come to understand. Whereas he would describe the modern industrial soundscape as a lo-fi soundscape, where there's often in the background always some kind of mechanical, electrical humming that is constantly accompanying us at all times and masking the potential richness of the natural world around us. So that is definitely, I think, a profound change.
Now, as a writer, the book For Whom the Bells Whom the Bell Tolls, is that right? Am I saying that right? Yes, by Ernest Hemingway. After reading your work, Alex, that title has rendered new meanings for me. And we don't need to go into a discussion about that, but it interests me now why Hemingway chose that title, but especially because of bells and death and how that they marked death or the approach of death. And something you say was interesting, that the differences of the bells ringing, its duration and intensity could convey even differences in class, gender, or age of the deceased. That's very interesting too, because now we're getting into sort of something deeper, we're not just hearing different soundscapes and soundscapes and recognizing them, but we're also how a person that dies is marked by the bells that ring. That's fascinating.
Like I said before, bells are a profound expression of power, of status. They're highly valuable objects. They're inevitably carefully controlled by authorities. And you're absolutely right that during funeral processions, the intensity, the length of bell ringing was often coordinated with social status. And so if a really illustrious prince or princess passed away, in some European pre-modern cities, you might hear bell ringing lasting an entire day, marking that death. Whereas you would have much more modest sounds for people of more modest means. But what is worth saying is no matter how poor or marginalized the person, there was an expectation that you would hear the sound of the bell. And in fact, it was a very controversial in places in Central Europe that were riven by religious conflict. That if, for example, if the Catholics took over a Protestant town, they would deny Protestants the privilege of ringing bells for their funerals.
So that it almost becomes political.
It absolutely becomes political and generates a massive amount of protest that is still recorded in archival documents today that you can go back and read. But bell sounds were really considered to be central, part and parcel to not just secular life, but the religious life. And for many, they really did embody this kind of sacral power to both bring people together and to drive away evil.
Yeah. We are almost at the end of our talk, but boy, did that go by quickly. Wow. That's nice. It's nice that you did send me another article, and I do want to give you a little bit of space for that, just because it's very recent, if I'm not mistaken. If you could why don't you just tell us a little bit about that, because it's a continuation of your studies in the soundscape, certainly, but a little bit different.
This is the one about the children and
Yes.
the processions.
Yes.
Yeah. I just had an article published that has to do with the Jesuits. So this new order of Catholic priests that emerged in the 16th century, and the Jesuits' use of singing in catechism instruction, especially for children. And I won't go too deep into it, but I think it is important to say that in an age of religious conflict, both sides of that conflict, both the Catholics as well as the Protestants, they really looked at children as the key for making long-standing religious change that would persist. And so the Lutherans developed not just catechism, but also simple songs for children to sing, to instruct them in the basic articles of the faith, and to tell them how they themselves, as Lutheran children, were different. They had different beliefs than that of the Catholics. The Jesuits picked up on this as well. And so some of my current research really does have to do with the ways in which Catholic Jesuits were trying to reclaim Protestant territory and cities in Germany by mobilizing children, by putting them on display in public, by making them march around and process, and by making them sing songs. Because they recognized, just as Luther recognized, that by setting words to music, you can memorize them much more easily than without. So they recognized that music was a key vehicle for actually learning the faith and for instilling these principles. And like I mentioned earlier, music can be used both to bring people together, but it can also be used to divide. And so it's both of those functions that is really fascinating to me in a context of social difference and religious difference.
And finally, where are you at with your future research? What do you want to do, or what are you? I mean, you've published a lot.
The books that I've written previously are really deep dives into very particular cities and places. I'm currently working on a book project which is about the soundscapes of German Catholicism in an age of religious conflict. And so this is meant to be geographically broad. I've been visiting archives and libraries all over Austria and Germany and even Italy, looking for original archival documents as well as music that hopefully will let me make a bigger argument about the ways in which German Catholics asserted themselves through the medium of sound. And so that will include elaborate part music, including sackbuts and things like that, but also simple songs like hymns. It will include bell ringing. It will include military drumming and trumpeting, as well as gunfire and cannon fire. And so a lot of work with sort of public rituals that were meant to deepen the identity of Catholics, to make them more convinced of the correctness of their belief, but also, frankly, sometimes to provoke and terrify Protestants at the same time. And so I'm hoping that book will be completed, fingers crossed, in the next 2 to 3 years.
Thank you, Alex. I really enjoyed our conversation, and this is Professor Alex Fischer from the UBC School of Music. He is a distinguished musicologist and also a performing musician, and it's been a real pleasure to speak with you. There will be a transcript of this talk on my blog, thehourisblue.com, and you've been listening to the Blue Hour on CITR 101.9 FM. And yeah, thank you, and I wish you happy travels, because it sounds like you are on the move for finding more archival sources for your research.
Yes, I am. Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thank you.